Hi, my name is Mitchell Daniels, historical interpreter and volunteer here with the Whitby Historical Society here at the historic Lynde House Museum. Today we're going to do something very special. Today I'm going to teach you how to make breakfast in the height of the Georgian era. We're here in a very historic house here in Whitby. This was the former home of Jabez and Clarissa Lynde, as well as their 8 children who lived here from about 1803 right up until 1893. This house was particularly busy during the height of the War of 1812, in which the Lyndes used this house, specifically this room in particular, as the tavern, serving various soldiers from the Fort York garrison, or what was known at the time as the garrison at York. Today we're going to be making a very common recipe for the Georgian era that would have been very familiar to both Jabez and Clarissa. We're going to be making a recipe known as Darby Cakes or griddle cakes. Darby Cakes are named after the town in the East Midlands known simply as Darby, and can trace their roots all the way back to medieval times when they were originally known as griddle cakes. For this recipe you will need 1 cup of currants, 3½ cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1 cup of unsalted butter, 1 cup of granulated sugar, 1 egg, and lastly, 1/2 cup of whole milk. Now this can either be cream or homogenized milk. This recipe appears in the Cook Not Mad or Rational Cookery from 1831. Rub 1 pound of butter into 2 pounds of sifted flour. Put 1 pound of currants, 1 pound of sugar, mix all together with 1/2 pint of milk, 1 egg, 2 teaspoons of pearlash, roll it out thin. Cut it into round cakes and bake them. Now the first thing that we're going to want to do to start off the prep work, which is probably the most time consuming, is we're going to want to soak our currants. So first of all, we're going to get our glass of water and our bowl of currants. So we're just going to pour the water into the bowl. Now you want to make sure that your water is lukewarm, and that's just basically to ensure that they absorb. Okay. And we'll let that sit for about 5 to 10 minutes or so to allow the currants to absorb the water. Next up, we're going to add the flour and baking soda together, and you want to make sure to mix this in really, really well. So we'll start off with the flour and we'll pour it into our mixing bowl. Now the original recipe calls for pearlash. Now pearlash, it is still available today, however, a much better alternative to use is our baking soda. So we'll add in the baking soda to the flour mix, and then you can mix it either with a spoon or with your hands. I find it best to use my hands to mix it in, so I'll just mix it all in. And once we've done that, then we can start adding in the rest of our ingredients. Next up, we're going to add in our eggs and milk. So first of all, of course, we need to break our 1 egg. So I'll just break it into the bowl here. And we'll mix it in. So we'll grab our spoon there and start whisking the egg. And you want to make sure that it's nicely whisked before you add in your milk. So once our egg is nice and beaten, we can now add in our milk to the mixture. Just pour it in. Continue to mix it for another moment or so. So now that we've let our currants soak for a few moments, we're going to now strain out our currants into another bowl. You want to make sure that, even though that we've now hydrated these currants, you want to make sure to try to get as much water out of the currants as possible before before adding them back into your original bowl. So as you can see, our currants are now rehydrated, so we can now add them into our mix. And we'll do that in just a moment, but first we need to add in our sugar. Next we're going to add in our sugar. So we'll just pour it into our dry mix, and then we'll mix it in again with our hands. Now again, you can do this both with a mixing spoon or with your hands, but this would have been very, very traditional. And then once we've got it all mixed in, we're then going to create a well inside the bowl to allow our wet ingredients to sit in. And we'll now add in our wet ingredients right into the center there. And now we can start to mix in our wet ingredients with our dry ingredients. Now you might need to add some additional milk as necessary, as it does get quite dry quite quick. You can see the dough is already starting to thicken up, and now we can add in our currants. Now, breakfast over the years has changed quite a lot from the first early breakfasts back in medieval times. In fact, when breakfast was first introduced, it was originally meant just as a meal to break fast or breakfast. And so this was typically a meal enjoyed after the morning church service back in the day when the church controlled quite a lot of aspects of everyday life. Now, as we go into the Georgian era, we begin to see breakfast more as a necessity, but typically it would have been divided into two separate meal times. First of all, you would have your sort of morning breakfast, which would consist of eggs and toast. And then later on, you might have your afternoon tea. This type of recipe could be used under both circumstances. Now, as we head into the Victorian era, we begin to see Victorians starting to have full breakfast parties. Now, typically these breakfast parties would consist of coffee, tea, and hot chocolate. In fact, it was very rare to find solid chocolate during the Victorian era, as hot chocolate was just a much more enjoyable drink of the era. And so you would often find hot chocolate in many different Victorian households. And typically these parties, even though they were breakfast parties, they could typically last the majority of the day. And so it was quite a big event, and Victorians, they loved to eat, and this was especially true for their breakfasts. Now, I've mixed in the ingredients a little bit, so now I'm just going to start to work the dough with my hands, and I might need to add in a bit more flour, so maybe I'll do that. So next up, now that we've started to mix in our mixture, we can now add in our butter. So in the Victorian era, you see a lot of different recipes actually call for you to mix in the butter just with your hands, and a large part of that is because as you're working in the butter into the mixture, the heat and the warmth from your hands just naturally melts the butter and creates a very nice consistency for your dough. So I'm just going to add some additional flour to our recipe, as you want to make sure that your dough is quite dry for this recipe, because too much moisture will cause the cakes to come out soggy. So I'll just add in this little bit of extra flour, and you'll probably want to continue to add in flour throughout the course of making this recipe. You want to just keep on mixing it and really forming the dough into really one big ball, and as you go through, you want to continue to layer the flour on. Over the years, the Lynde House has had its fair share of some very famous visitors of the time, especially during the War of 1812, when the Lyndes operated the house as a tavern. Now, the tavern was simply known as Lynde's, and was also used as a field hospital for wounded soldiers during the War of 1812. Now, just prior to the outbreak of the Battle of York in 1813, General Brock and his aide-de-camp actually came by and complimented on what a fine house this was. You know, sometimes I do wonder, what what sort of meals would the general himself have chosen to eat when he came to a tavern such as Lynde's? Perhaps he might have had some Darby Cakes. Now, we do know for certain that typically you would have had your typical rations of either pork or beef, and either a pound of flour or a loaf of bread. But really and truly, we don't really know exactly what General Brock would have eaten. Of course, he would have been traveling all across Upper Canada to command the British Army during the War of 1812, and so it definitely makes you wonder, and this is one of the really cool things about history is, what were they eating? And so this is one of the really fun things about historic cookery is you can sort of rediscover some of those long-lost recipes from the time period. So now I've got this dough all nicely mixed in, I think we can now start to roll it out. So first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get a bit of flour on your cutting board or working surface. You just want to just spread it all around. Make sure that there's a nice covering of flour all over your cutting board. I think we should be good. We can always add in more later. And then of course you want to make sure to get your rolling pin all nice and covered as well. Ideally with this recipe, the more flour the better. So you just massage it onto your rolling pin. And now, we can take out our dough. And I'm going to break this in half. This does make quite a few cakes. Add a bit more flour to the mix. So ideally, you don't really want this dough to be sticky. You want it to be very, very, very dry. Just give it a nice little pat down, and then you can start to roll it out. And you really want this dough to be extremely thin, because when you go to cook it, it will rise quite a fair bit. So this might take a few minutes to roll, but ideally you want it to be a nice thin consistency. In fact, even maybe a little bit thinner than this. And you'll find that you'll probably want to roll this out multiple times. But once you have a nice consistency, now you can choose your mold that you want. In the Victorian era, they had a multitude of different molds to choose from. More traditionally, they might just have one big circle, but for the purposes of today's video, we are going to cut it into smaller pieces. So we're going to use this mold here today. So ideally, you're just going to want to bring the cutter into the dough and then move it away, and then you have your first Darby cake. So now that we've had a few Darby cakes cut up, we can now start to add them onto our griddle. Now traditionally these would be considered to be a very typical hearth cooking recipe, but traditionally they would have been set on your typical crane here. Now this would have been found in many Georgian households. So what we're going to do is we'll just stick this, and then traditionally these would just be placed onto the griddle, and would then be placed back over on the fire. Now traditionally you're going to want to leave these on the stove. If you're cooking them on the stove, then you're going to want to flip them over, but basically you want to have them cooking until both sides are light golden brown. Now you'll find that they're also ready because they will be rather crumbly to the touch, and you will definitely be able to smell the currants. It's quite a very unique smell, and it's always delicious. Oh, heavenly. These just came out of the oven, so they're all done now. And of course, it's now time for the moment of truth. Of course, I always find that Darby cakes go best with a nice cup of tea, which is precisely what I'm going to do now. Let's give this a bit of a taste. So this is exactly the perfect consistency. It's nice and dry, and as you can see, it crumbles very easily. Let's see how they turned out. Absolutely perfection. You definitely want to serve these nice and hot to really get the full flavor. And if you can, alternatively, when you're cooking them, you can also cook them over a charcoal barbecue to get really that true smoky feel, and these are absolutely amazing. Perfectly ideal for having for a full breakfast. As I say, you don't necessarily need to cut these up into the small pieces like we have here today, but you can definitely just serve them basically as essentially the same size as a typical pancake. And yeah, these make an absolutely amazing breakfast. And the flavor here, you know, you can really taste the currants, and of course you can choose to make this with or without currants, but the currants really seem to make it. It's just absolutely amazing. This has been how to make Darby cakes in a traditional Georgian kitchen. Thanks for watching. We look forward to seeing you at the museum in the near future.